Let's talk about a number so huge it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. But its impact? Well, that's felt in the daily lives of billions of people. We're talking about the world's public debt. And believe me, it's not just some dry economic figure, it's a force that is actively shaping our world right now. So let's break down what that really means. $97 trillion. That's what the world's public debt hit in 2023. And this isn't just some static number sitting on a page. No, it's more like a giant snowball rolling downhill, picking up speed. Get this, it grew by a mind-boggling $5.6 trillion in just 1 year. And as we're about to see, that kind of growth has massive, massive consequences. So what does a number that big actually mean for all of us? You know, for the real world. To figure that out, we've got to look a little closer at the problem. And that starts with one really important question. Where is all this debt actually piling up? Okay, here's the first thing you need to know. While debt is growing pretty much everywhere, that burden is not being shared equally. Not even close. Public debt in developing countries is rising at double the rate of developed nations. And that widening gap, it's really at the heart of this whole crisis. But here's where it gets kind of strange. Even with that super fast growth, developing countries hold less than a third of the world's total debt. So you have to ask, why are they feeling the pressure so much more? The answer starts to pull back the curtain on a global financial system that is, frankly, deeply unequal. To really see the real-world impact, let's just zoom in on one region for a second. In Africa, the median debt level has now climbed past 60% of the continent's entire economic output. Now, when a country owes that much compared to what it earns, it creates this enormous strain that threatens its ability to invest in its own people, in its own future. And not strain. It isn't just about numbers on a balance sheet. We're talking about a very real human cost. It forces governments into what is basically an impossible choice, what the UN calls an unpayable price. Just look at this trend. Between 2010 and 2022, sure, spending on vital things like education and health went up, but look at interest payments. They grew far, far faster. To put it simply, money that could be building schools or hospitals is instead just flowing out the door to service debt. And when you break it down per person, that trade-off becomes crystal clear. In Africa, for example, governments spent an average of $70 per person just on interest payments. Now compare that to only $39 per person spent on health. The priorities aren't being set by what people need, they're being dictated by debt. So what does this all add up to? It adds up to this one staggering figure, 3.3 billion. That's how many people live in countries where the government is now forced to spend more money paying interest than on educating its kids or caring for its sick. Just let that sink in for a second. That's the unsustainable reality for nearly half the people on this planet. So, how in the world did we get here? How did this happen on such a massive scale? To really understand that, we need to look at the mechanics of it all, what you might call the architecture of our global financial system. A huge piece of the puzzle is the completely unequal cost of borrowing money. On average, African nations pay nearly 10 times the interest rate that a country like Germany does. They're paying this massive premium just to get financing, which makes it almost impossible to ever get ahead. And what makes this all worse is a growing reliance on private creditors. We're talking bondholders, commercial banks. They now hold over 60% of developing countries' external debt, and that brings a perfect storm of problems. The debt is harder to renegotiate, it's way more expensive, and it's notoriously volatile. And if you want to see that volatility in action, just look at 2022. Private lenders pulled a record $890 billion out of developing economies. That is a massive outflow of cash at the exact moment these countries need an investment the most. It just pushes them deeper and deeper into crisis. Okay, so this system is clearly not working for everybody. But just diagnosing the problem, that's only the first step. The good news is there are very clear calls for reform, and the United Nations has actually outlined a plan to try and fix this broken architecture. So the UN's plan basically focuses on 3 key things. First, create a fair process for when countries get into trouble to tackle those high debt costs. Second, we need to dramatically increase the amount of affordable long-term loans for development, not just rely on commercial debt. And third, expand emergency funds so countries aren't forced to take on crippling debt every time a crisis hits. In the end, it all comes down to this really powerful idea from the UN report. The whole point of the international financial system should be to support human development, not to undermine it. Forcing countries into a choice between paying their debt or serving their people, that's a false choice. And it's one that a reformed, fairer system should never, ever demand.